Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, after U.S. President Donald Trump's verbal U-turn over the ZTE ban, Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will visit Washington this week to discuss bilateral trade. Can Liu and his American counterparts resolve trade tensions? And to get a grip on the rapidly changing China-U.S. trade tensions, I spoke with two experts who analyze what is in store for the world's two biggest economies. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. We begin today's show with China-U.S. trade tensions and trade talks, too. U.S. President Donald Trump has tweeted that he is working with Chinese President Xi Jinping to get ZTE back into business in the U.S. This reversal in rhetoric comes just 4 weeks after Trump's administration's banned U.S. companies from exporting to ZTE. President Xi Jinping's economic advisor, Vice Premier Liu He, will visit Washington this week to meet U.S. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin and other White House officials. Can Liu's trip this time succeed in preventing bilateral trade ties from souring further?
Another round of trade talks. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He, who's the special envoy of Chinese President Xi Jinping, leads a delegation to the U.S. at the invitation of Washington from Tuesday to Saturday.
Vice Premier Liu will continue to hold consultations with the U.S. economic team on economic and trade issues between the two countries.
This follows a high-level meeting with U.S. Treasury Secretary Mnuchin in Beijing on May 3 and 4. The frequent discussions between both sides may bode well in setting the stage for a de-escalation of trade tensions, which have simmered in the past few months. The Trump administration has threatened to impose tariffs on up to $150 billion worth of Chinese goods, while China has vowed to retaliate against U.S. exports if the Trump administration did levy the tariffs. But 2 days ago, Mr. Trump tweeted that he and Chinese President Xi Jinping are working together to give massive Chinese phone company ZTE a way to get back into business fast. His decision would like to be seen as a concession in the ongoing talks between Beijing and Washington to resolve the trade conflict. Mr. Trump's change in tune, welcoming Beijing as a positive step, could create a better atmosphere for ongoing discussions.
For more on China-U.S. trade relations, we are joined in our Beijing studio Mr. Liu Baocheng, the Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics. Welcome, sir, to our program. In Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, the Managing Director and Head of Research from Qualcomm International. In New York, U.S., we have Robert Hormat, the Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates. He's also the former Undersecretary of State for Economic Business and Agricultural Affairs, in fact, playing an important role in the establishment of diplomatic relations between China and the United States when it comes to economic issues. Let me begin with you, Mr. Horvat, if I can. How should we see Vice Premier Liu He's trip to the United States? Critical point, hearings going on at the Capitol Hill. Well, at the same time, there are a lot of different opinions inside the United States about China.
Yes, I think this is a very important visit. The general view in Washington, at least publicly, was that the last set of negotiations didn't go as far as the administration wanted and didn't really deal with some of the issues China wanted either. So this is another opportunity to talk. And I think there has been, particularly in the president's decision on ZTE, something that can be called a confidence builder on the China side, where the president clearly has been listening to President Xi Jinping about the importance of ZTE and made some very surprise decisions to help ensure that it didn't have further problems. So I think the environment for this discussion is improved, but there's still a lot, clearly a lot going on behind the scenes that we're not aware of, and I don't think the Vice Premier would have come here unless there had been some behind-the-scenes progress on some of these trade issues.
Surprise decision, that was Mr. Hormats used when it comes to the words to describe the latest development with ZTE. But, you know, we don't know whether that ZTE is a single issue or whether it is likely to be the logic how U.S. is going to deal with some of those technology companies coming from China.
Well, we are not surprised by the surprise produced by Donald Trump anyway. So, at least this is really a friendly atmosphere to prepare a way for a more positive and a more measurable result that can really bring on the table upon the Premier's visit to the United States. So I think that's going to be expectation that something very realistic to narrow the gap, and people might expect that there can be a sort of a shopping list, and also because 8 points have been raised with China by the United States, and whether China, after 1 week's discussion or even rehearsal, that they can really bring something that is there at least to be closer to what was really demanded by the U.S. side.
Well, is that likely to happen, Mr. Hong? Remember last time during the first round, there seems to be a lot of resentment because the U.S. side abruptly brought out the long list of demands for China to accomplish, and China took it very, in a way, negatively, because it is not supposed to be a sovereign state telling another sovereign state what to do.
Yeah, well, the negotiation has to start from somewhere. Even though last time when the U.S. team kickstarted the negotiation, you know, the two sides the demand was really too far apart, but it's nevertheless a good start. So today, actually, you know, recently, Mr. Donald Trump actually tweeted that it's instructing the U.S. Commerce Department, you know, to reconsider the ZTE case. It's actually showing that the U.S. side willing to negotiate with the Chinese team. So I would say it's a good start.
Well, we could say it's a good start, but it's so far away from a good result. I mean, at least the result expected by both sides. It has to be mutually acceptable and win-win for both. Mr. Hormats, therefore, to U.S., what will be the bottom line of so-called the win-win? Do you think the current administration is thinking about win-win or winner takes all?
Well, that's a very good question. I think there has been, coming from the White House and other parts of Washington, and I go there quite regularly and talk to people there, a feeling that the trade relationship is imbalanced. Certainly the President says this periodically by pointing to the trade deficit the United States has with China. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who say trade deficits are not the core of the problem, and there's a debate in Washington. There's one group of people who says that the negotiation should be about reducing the trade imbalance, and the President talks about this. There's another group that says it should be about a broader set of issues, which is protection of intellectual property, foreign investment by American companies in China. Do they have more opportunity, or should there be restrictions on Chinese investment here in certain areas? So one group has a trade balance focus. Another group has a more structural focus on intellectual property, trade secrets, and a wide range of points that the business community frequently raise with the administration. So figuring out the American position is going to be a very significant thing, and figuring out what China is willing to give to the United States and what China wants from the United States, which is always going to be part of a negotiation as well.
Well, Mr. Hormats, I understand you served the various administrations, whether Republican or Democrat. The question really is, do you think this time the U.S.-China trade discussion, is it only about trade, or it is about something much bigger than trade now, Mr. Hormats, that we are letting the cornerstone of the relationship, which is trade and economic ties, now be the testing stone of the nature of this bilateral relations for the near future?
You're absolutely right. The relationship is about trade, but trade has bigger, and investment also. They both have bigger implications. And as you correctly point out, if the trade and investment relationship goes sour or deteriorate, or don't get better, at least somewhat, relatively soon, it could affect political relations and other kinds of relations in a broader sense, and the overall question of trust. And therefore, in particular, it relates to the questions related to the Korean Peninsula, because clearly China plays a major role on those issues, and the United States and China are talking, and it can't help but be in the back of people's minds, even if we don't talk about it in Washington very much, that if the trade part of the relationship doesn't work, then it may be somewhat harder to work on the Korean issue with leaders in Beijing. So the two are related, at least psychologically, and maybe in other ways as well.
Mr. Hong, there are different debates also going on in China as well, as you may be aware from Hong Kong, that people see these issues between China and the United States. They are interlinked, but at the same time, when they are interlinked, it could be very vulnerable for every issue of this overall pact of the bilateral relations. And Mr. Hong, how do you see the nature now going on for round 2 of U.S.-China trade talks? Is it about trade, or is it about much bigger issues?
Yeah, it's a little difficult to second guess, what's the nature of the negotiation really is about. The market seems to be pricing in a scenario that's substantially much further than a simple trade negotiation and trade talks. Reason being, during the initial stage of the negotiation, the Made in China 2025 was brought onto the table, and which we all know is one of the key strategies China is pursuing, going forward. So I think China, the Chinese market is trying to decipher bits and pieces of information from this trade negotiation, and also because the market does not necessarily have all the information required to price in all the scenarios. So at this moment in time, the market seems to be thinking that it's substantially more than just simple trade talks.
Professor Liu, there are several things going on right here. One of the things, Professor Liu, is that the trade balance, whether and should be corrected to the degree that the U.S. wants, asking China to correct it by the year, just a few years from now. But the other thing is whether this so-called May the 2022 issue with China, which is about how China wants to develop its new high-tech field for the near future, is likely to be discussed between China and the United States context. So, Professor Liu, when things are getting ever more mixed up right now, where do you think is the direction that China would like to take?
Well, China is ready for trade liberalization, but where the U.S. is really bargaining for deeper and more profound changes, which is the competitive structure. Well, they do not really want to nullify the China's, the leadership in the emerging industries, but they warn that the government subsidies will really be there to distort trade, even if you support the new technologies, and that can really turn out to be an import substitution program that can hurt the U.S. suppliers' interest. It is far more from the trade issues. The trade issues can easily, to be dealt with, and well, when we are talking about future leadership, so that's something that can alert the whole world. And of course, China is having a bigger stake. But having said that, well, China has a very strong nationalistic feeling that we want to be self-sufficient in every major industries, in every major technologies. But I would see that the world globalization is really pushing forward specialization, that no one is really being able to make everything so complete and so independent. So a smoother and more transparent and more sustainable relationship between the two biggest economies will be there to help both of these countries, but also to the world.
If you listen very closely to the answers of our three panelists, could tell certain messages are being sent by different sides. Let me go to you once again, Mr. Hormat, about this. One of the things that people have to look at is the latest hearing taking place starting from Tuesday. Also coincides with Mr. Liu He's visit to Washington. There are several people coming from different organizations and business communities that are likely to speak there. You got the Best Buy, which is a retailer, HP, tech company, and you also got U.S. Steel, of course, the steel and traditional sector. You also have National Association of Retailers, National Association of Manufacturers. None of these seems to be gonna say very positive stuff about U.S.-China trade in the current framework, because they're likely to be some of the factors negatively impacted. So, Mr. Hormats, where is the hearing direction going? Is it really helping the United States to make the right decision, or is it helping the United States to make the decision as it wants to have?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and you're right about the timing, because it occurs roughly the same time that trade talks are taking place. And the point about this is it's the Senate Banking Committee, and it's looking at Chinese investment and foreign investment in general. It's not just applicable to China, it's applicable to all foreign investment, although China will get a lot of the focus. And then there's the discussion and the hearings on the question of the $50 billion in trade that will be affected by new tariffs that President Trump has announced. So there are really two things going on here. So it's very hard to sort these out. On the tariff issue, the real question, I think, for the importers that sell things is they like Chinese goods because Chinese goods lower the price, they have more volume to sell, people go into these stores and buy Chinese things, and they like that. On the other hand, and a lot of the producers of high technology want to have more access to the China market, so they have a different set of issues. And then there's a third group that wants more restrictions on Chinese products coming into the U.S. So one of the things that the hearings on the tariffs, the 50 billion on 50 billion products in products, will say is that there are differences. There are differences of opinion within the American business community and with the American economic community in general. So one of the things we'll see in these hearings is major differences, and the administration has to sort this out, and in doing so determine whether there are exceptions, whether they're not exceptions, how much to hit with higher tariffs, and where to take things off the table. So it'll create an environment where that's very complicated, and it will help the administration, I think, to at least understand the pressures it's feeling from within the U.S. in addition to pressures from China.
The word that you used, Mr. Hormat, to help the administration is a very interesting one. Mr. Hong, we do not know how likely the Capitol Hill is going to work or not with the White House on this decision. After all, the president seemed to have a lot say in making a decision about trade issue. Mr. Hong, what do you make of this mixed picture of the Capitol Hill, the White House, and the administration trying to have a talk at the same time?
Yeah, there are many interest parties involved in this negotiation. Even from the Chinese side, you have seen the semiconductor group and also other groups have a very eager sort of interest to say in this negotiation. So I think we're still in a very early stage. We're just going through 2 rounds of back and forth negotiation, and now that the Chinese delegation may be going to the U.S. for a new round of negotiation as well. So at the moment, there's still too much information to digest. It's very difficult to see to foretell which direction the trade talks will go.
Okay, Mr. Hormat, if I could come back to you once again, the scenarios you see from now on, because there is a time limit, supposed to be 60 days, 45 days, things like that, for the U.S. side to decide whether those so-called punishing tariffs will be inflicted upon Chinese products. On the other hand, there's also be a longer stretch of time when some of the key decisions have to be made regarding China-U.S. trade. So what kind of time frame do you think, sir, we should really look at? Will the so-called 45 days really 45 days, or there's very different ways of nuance that we can take a look at that?
It's a great question. The administration, I think, is now recognizing that the process is far more complicated than perhaps they thought it was even a few weeks or months ago, and that is they're seeing a lot of divided interests in this country with different sets of objectives, first of all. Second, the process of sorting out requests for exemptions on those tariffs internally in the U.S. has become very complicated, as it is on the steel and aluminum tariff issue as well. And third, this all goes into a political process that will affect the political relationship. And then there are a whole range of other domestic issues that relate to consumers. So this is about trade on one hand, but it's far more complicated. I think it's going to be very hard to sort this out in 45 days. And we shouldn't expect that trade negotiations, however good the negotiators and committed they are going to be able to resolve a lot of these issues very quickly. So you really have the tariff-related time frame and then the longer-term time frame of trying to sort out the broader issues and develop solutions that are mutually agreeable. That is going to take time. I've been a trade negotiator. I've been Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. I know it takes time. Liu He is a very good negotiator. Bob Lighthizer has very different views. I know him quite well. They're two experienced people,
right,
but they have a whole bureaucracy and a lot of competing pressures on them to try to work things out. I think they want to resolve major issues, but it's not so easy to do, and they may have different sets of objectives for the end product of the negotiations that they have to sort out.
Professor Liu, how do you look at the complexity and the nuances pointed out by the other two guests, not to mention the list that you have on your hand right now?
Well, yes, there are very divided interest groups that are involved in there. You know, those who are on the bus would like to close the door, and those who are waiting for the bus would, you know, like to keep the bus over there waiting for them. So after all, I would really expect that if the tariff can be postponed, that would be a very ideal outcome. And to completely eliminate the tariff, I do not think they are really politically acceptable, but yes, to give a longer period of time for both sides to sit together, to simmer in a lot of those ideological issues and also the realistic agenda.
Okay.
I think that's the very positive solution already. But the friction will have to be there. So in that, I would really still think that the Trump's tweet on the ZTE issue is really an isolated issue that is not really part of the package for the 301 tariff.
We'll see what's going to happen. Before we go, I want to have very briefly a sentence from every one of you. What do you think is likely to be taken care of by round 2? Professor Liu, you go first, very briefly.
I would say to postpone the retaliation and bring a longer period of time for people to really come to a realistic and positive solution.
Mr. Hong?
Yeah, we are buying some more time for a better negotiation. So more likely than not, some progress is going to be made.
Okay. Well, Mr. Hormat, progress?
I agree. Some progress is likely to be made, but the key now is to put together negotiating teams on both sides so that when Vice Premier Liu He leaves, there will be a group of people who work on the detailed components of a package. They can reach a broad set of principles in terms of their agreement, but the real work frequently is done between major negotiations of top leaders and more by people who are experts in the area. So they have to have an ongoing process.
We hope that process will be well established after round 2. For now, thank you so much for the 3 of you for being with us. Liu Baocheng, Hong Hao, last but not least, Robert Hormat. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. Thank you. You are watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on the program.